Great. So, hi everyone. This is Mark Sorrell. I'm an associate partner with McKinsey & Company, and thank you very much for making the time today to join this webinar. Look very much forward to the discussion and conversation as we proceed. I think Christina will help to kind of moderate the questions as they come in, and we can make sure that we have as interactive a discussion as possible. I'm part of our cybersecurity practice, where, among other things, I help lead our cybersecurity practice for private equity sponsors and private equity and venture capital portfolio companies. And it's in that context that we're here today to talk a little bit more about an article that some of you might have read previously, written by our practice about cybersecurity as the digital linchpin. So in that vein, there are some materials here that we wanted to walk through. We'll go through these and of course welcome interruptions and questions as we proceed, and looking very much forward to having the discussion as we go. So if we go to the next page, please. So I think there are a couple basic beliefs that we have as a practice, having served a number of portfolio companies across PE and VC contexts on the topic. And we're here to talk a little bit about how those have implications for the digital enterprise. The first thing is that cybersecurity isn't just about risk, it's a strategic issue. What do we mean when we say strategic? I think what we really mean here is that cybersecurity is in many ways the great rate limiter today to technological innovation and value creation at speed for companies. So it's not just about dealing with scary threats or news that's in the headlines about the latest WannaCry ransomware type attack. It's actually about getting risk right and getting cybersecurity right for your business to unlock product capability, improve organizational effectiveness, and actually deliver new value propositions to customers, whether it's through the trust that you build or markets that you're able to access, through regulatory approvals for the security hygiene that you're able to prove you have in place. And when we think about transitioning to digital enterprises, that's really increasing the stakes for getting cybersecurity right, as well as at the same time disrupting existing security practices as enterprises move out from behind a firewall perimeter, compute moves towards the edge, workloads migrate toward the cloud, application development teams move from waterfall to DevOps approaches, and overall the organization moves toward an agile way of executing and doing its business. What we would say in that context is that effective cybersecurity is about much more than just getting risk right, as we mentioned earlier. It's actually dependent on a set of not just structures, processes, and skill sets, but also people and technology to make sure that you're really building it into the business to enable value creation. And that most of what you need to do to transform cybersecurity and make sure that it can keep up with the pace of change in the enterprise, the market, and your competitors, as well as the customers that you're serving, is to make sure that what you do to transform cybersecurity is a process that goes well beyond the Chief Information Security Officer organization and the technical individuals who are owning cybersecurity as a responsibility day to day. So those are some of the basic beliefs to frame our discussion today. Let me pause there to see if there are any questions from people on the line on these particular points. If not, I'll begin to go into some of the deeper thoughts we have on these basic beliefs. Great. So if we keep going, the next page. When we talk about the digital economy, we also like to think about data and think particularly about which industries are most affected by cybersecurity and cybersecurity issues as a topic within the enterprise. And I think specifically there, as you can see here, when you look across different enterprises where a double dark check mark indicates material criticality of the imperatives on the left-hand side, no check mark reflects that it doesn't really apply, and an empty check mark or single dark check mark indicates that it applies less. In those contexts, you'll see here, I think the main takeaway is that a lot of the core strategic imperatives are industry agnostic in terms of applying to most industries as we go, but that there are some that are more salient for some industries than others. So for example, physical product design really applying to healthcare, pharma, advanced industries, to some extent to energy, utilities, and telecom, media, and tech. but that also there are ones, as I mentioned, that are really agnostic, which are the regulatory side. And I'm sure more than a few folks on the phone are familiar with ISO 27001, potentially FFIEC regulation requirements, of course, on the privacy side, GDPR, and other cybersecurity reporting requirements, particularly in US states, where now all 50 states have a perspective on this. So those are some of the key things to keep in mind. If you go to the next page, I think when we look at cybersecurity and how interconnected it is, I think we would say that cybersecurity is really intertwined with technology evolutions, and these are ones that are required to deliver on digital capabilities. So on the left-hand side of this page, whether you're thinking about analytics, robot process automation, API ecosystems, agile development, public cloud infrastructure, architecture and operation, or enterprise mobility through bring your own devices, or connecting devices through Internet of Things type networks, all of these have implications from a security perspective. And I'll just give you one example. So on the analytics side, what we often find is that for enterprises or for startups that are really looking to build an analytic capability at the center of their value creation, whether that, if you're say in consumer or retail, you're probably going to want to have some kind of a data lake that collects and aggregates consumer data that allows you to learn more about your customer and how to create the right experience for them that's delightful. And as you do that, what we've also found is that building trust with those consumers by handling their data carefully and effectively is important, not just for compliance reasons, but also for business reasons. And I'll just to give you an example, recent survey data suggests that over 20% of consumers would likely take their business elsewhere if they learned that one of their consumer or retail brands that they're interacting with and purchasing things from online had materially mishandled their personal data. So either their passwords or usernames or credit card accounts or the like. So the stakes here are material, they're real, and they're applicable across digital transformation topics. Given how important I think these different categories are to more than a few of you on the phone, let me just pause here to see if there are any questions or anything that might be top of mind for any of the listeners on the line about things that your companies might be grappling with today.
And to all the listeners, feel free to type in your questions in the question box. No questions.
Okay, great. We'll keep going. Next page. So I think to both protect and enable the digital enterprise, companies have to pursue three core cybersecurity imperatives. If we start with this on the left-hand side of the page, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but there's a real imperative around building cybersecurity into business products and processes. We can talk a little bit more about what that means as you think about a secure ecosystem and about how you share unstructured data securely and seamlessly. Unstructured data being things like the emails that you keep in the inbox of your Office 365 suite. I think really what this is about, though, at a startup level, is about making sure that as you're making decisions about what applications to build, for example, you're ensuring that your application building team is taking time across ceremonies and across stages of whatever DevOps or other agile or development processes they might follow to make sure that they're accounting for security requirements as they build what they're building. And the imperative for getting that right is again, not just about ensuring that you don't have buggy code. It's making sure that you're not delaying time to market for your capabilities because of downstream rework precipitated because of security concerns. And in a digitally competitive world, getting that right really, really matters. Because if you're slow to market or slower than your competitor, that can be the difference in adoption that ultimately leads to the difference in success versus failure for the business. The other two imperatives we would call out are around creating mature risk management grounded in analytics. I think what we really mean here is that getting cybersecurity right is about taking a risk-based approach. It's less about looking at benchmarks from a security scorecard or a BitSite or different types of vendors that may have a elegant credit score for you or credit type score for you compared to peers. It's much more about, as an organization, with your leadership, defining what is the risk you're willing to accept in cybersecurity and what are the risks that you are not, and therefore what are the controls and control levels you need to have in place, and where are you in your journey to get to having those control levels in place versus the current state. And having that fact base of what your risk appetite for the organization is, where you are compared to where you want to be, and by the way, through threat intelligence, who is interested in attacking you and how, that can get you to a point where your cybersecurity becomes not a one-way ratchet, but a two-way ratchet. What I mean by one-way versus two-way is that in many enterprises that are not taking a risk-based approach, cybersecurity today is a one-way ratchet where it's very hard, once you put in place a control or a tool, to justify removing it, because in many cases the fact base doesn't exist for explaining the risk and return allocations that result from removing that capability or control. Once you have a risk-based approach in place with an established fact base of threat intelligence and perspective on risk appetite, plus an agreed upon set of controls and journey toward putting them in place, you can begin to make the fact-based case to non-technical executive decision makers on whether and how to update, remove, consolidate, or optimize the cybersecurity technical stack, as well as the operations for the function in the company. And then the last imperative we would call out here is around integrating cybersecurity with digital technology models. So this is really around a couple elements, I think, around making sure that you're using cloud adoption to enhance security, improving developer experience, reducing manual activity for the security team through automation, and other things like replacing passwords with more secure and convenient authentication, and enabling secure usage of RPA and analytics. So really making sure that security is a foundational part of new ways of working that help enable the business. If we go to the next page, what we'll see here is that as we dive a little bit deeper into cloud and cloud security and its implications, I think the main point of this page is that we're actually in the early innings of cloud and cloud security as a topic in the enterprise. I'm sure more than a few people on this line are familiar with probably the most prominent example of cloud security concerns, which is the recent Capital One breach involving Amazon AWS. And I think in the aftermath of that incident, there's been a lot of discussion at the enterprise down to the startup level about how and to what extent do companies that procure cloud platform services from providers like Amazon or Google bear a responsibility for ensuring the security of their company vis-a-vis the usage of that platform. And as you all continue to scale using resources like those, I think that where the kind of predominant or preponderance of the opinion today is coming out is that there is more responsibility that companies will be expected to bear going forward for validating the security and controls of their cloud service provider. And so thinking about what that means for you as an organization, particularly as in line, I'm sure, with more than a few of the respondents captured in this survey, as you too begin to migrate more workloads into public cloud or potentially start unencumbered by tech debt in the public cloud 100%, you want to think about what do the heightened expectations of accountability and responsibility for security vis-a-vis cloud from external providers mean for how you allocate resource and team to that topic. If we go to the next page, I think what we see here is a little bit of a double click on the story about migration, in that this responsibility and importance of paying attention to cloud security is only going to deepen across industries, across company sizes in the next 5 years as more workloads move into public cloud and rely upon a cloud service platform and providers to deliver the capability. Go to the next page. And so as you think about the migration to public cloud, it's not just about the Capital One story and who bears responsibility for cybersecurity. Another important dimension to this story is understanding what the potential benefits of moving to cloud can be, and how to think about cybersecurity as a linchpin of unlocking the full value of that public cloud infrastructure. So when we think about the benefits of public cloud from a security perspective, there are a few that really stand out with attendant risks. I think the first one is that you get from cloud service providers a robust set of knobs you can turn, and that this actually enables simplified rollout of new security capability because of just how centralized the public cloud platform you're operating on is. The challenge there, though, is what to do with all those knobs, and what else do you need beyond what they're providing, given the disposition of your workloads in that environment versus others. And so where and how to draw the line from a resource perspective, and how to think about peering around the corner of your future plans for migration to ensure that you're accounting for the resource allocation effectively, is a pretty important set of open questions to address early. And what we typically find at the startup level, this ends up being whoever the IT lead is, sitting down with whoever the chief commercial officer is, and maybe a representative from the product team to talk through the decision making and trade-offs there are to ensure that you're spending what you need to spend, but nothing more, and not underspending in such a way that precious venture capital or other dollars that could be allocated toward commercial growth are not getting leaked away as a consequence of failure to do the right security work and the right planning up front for migration. The other two things we would call out here are that cloud service providers are really going to need to evolve their security offerings to stay abreast of threats and make sure that they're refreshing features and controls for tenants. I think Capital One, as a situation, put that in a sharp relief, where there was feedback that AWS had been receiving for months about concerns and with certain parts of their architecture and infrastructure. And those concerns manifested themselves through the breach, which was enabled by AWS's failure to attend to those sets of feedback that had been coming from the user community. And so I think what you can expect there too, for each of you as startups, the implication is, both yourselves and through your venture capital sponsors, you have arguably elevated recourse to the cloud service provider to deliver feedback on security and the operation of the platform, and to have your concerns heard in action sooner, faster. And that's something that you should really take advantage of as you try to make sure that the cloud providers and the infrastructure and architecture they're providing to you are really working for you and meeting your business needs. The last thing that we would call out here is that cloud tenants that share security responsibilities with the CSP, that overall that they do, and this goes back to the earlier conversation about the shift in the balance of responsibility between the service provider and the user on security. I think while service providers are certainly going to do their best to improve and be more responsive, the reality is that especially for you all as fast-moving startups, you can't wait for them to catch up. And so a lot of the responsibility, maybe more than what you might have previously imagined, is on you as institutions to make sure that you have a point of view you can share with board or with potential next round investors about what your policies are. I'll just give you an example of a very mature tech company operating in the geospatial industry that decided to put on paper in a very clearly written white paper policy their cloud security approach, and to describe it in that document in ways that would be understandable for a non-technical executive or investor, as well as credible for a potential auditor and actionable for their team internally to make sure they were adhering to the policy. And so thinking for yourselves, granted there are a lot of other demands on your time at the stage of growth you're at, but taking the time with the right set of stakeholders to compose and align on a memorialized approach for cloud security can pay dividends in terms of, literally in terms of the comfort and conviction that can help investors nervous about the security of your business can help them get, as well as giving your team clear guidance on what it is there is to do regarding cloud and cloud security, and the implications of what there is to do for how you think about managing cloud security going forward. Let's go to the next page. So as we think about where breaches come from, especially regarding cloud, as we continue our deep dive here, we would say that they typically come from misconfiguration instead of technical compromise. And the implication there, I think, for all of you in your current phase of maturity and growth, is there's a real, if you think about the maturity of the organizations listed here on the left-hand side of the page and where you're at, and I would think a major implication from this page is that if you haven't already, having some kind of outside service, or if you have the capability internally, having your team do it, to validate that you have the right configuration and make the time to talk with peers to understand more about leading practice around configuration for tools, especially focused on cloud and the security layer around it. Let me pause there and just check again to see if there are any questions that pop up. If not, we'll keep going. Okay, we'll go to the next page. So there's a real emerging tension, not just as a consequence of this shift between provider and user responsibility for security, but also just between cloud speed and the existing cybersecurity operating model that most companies follow. And there are a number of pain points you can really point to here where once you begin to go into cloud and everything that comes with it, especially for digital cloud native application development, a lot of these pain points come into particularly sharp relief. So if we start at what I'd call 12 o'clock on this clock and move ourselves clockwise, we'll see the first major pain point being around architecture team requirements for approval. And the main challenge here is that designing the secure architecture and getting the approvals requires special knowledge and it can be bureaucratically cumbersome. When we think about how to address it, part of it is about being able to make sure that you're able to attract and retain the right capabilities. And if you're not, and particularly when you're on a lean budget and you're still early days, as many of you are, you may want to think about how you engage one of the, for lack of a better phrase, circuit riding managed security service providers. So before it was acquired by Aon, Stroz Friedberg would be a good example of this, where they can kind of essentially loan you a CISO or security architect for a period of time who can come in and be empowered by the business to make the decisions that that person, if they had them full-time, would make. And that can be a major accelerant past this pain point as you move toward cloud. I think the other two that, really the other one that I would call out here is security reviews, particularly at the implementation pre-code phase and post-code review pre-testing phase, where there's real work to be done on looking at secure code. There are solutions out there that can help with this. Black Duck, of course, is an example. There are a number of others. But in a world where 80 to 90% of code used in most commercial applications ends up being straight or derived from open source code, and open source tends to be particularly buggy, the premium to place on secure code review and test as an organization, particularly when you're early days and trying to make your mark through the applications that you build or bring to market, can't emphasize enough in this schematic how important that element is. And then the last one I think we call out is just around thinking about testing and deployment and the reviews and testing that are required there. And so making sure that you're configuring the security standards, instrumenting with monitoring before you deploy into production, and that you have the right capabilities in place that optimize your security stack. So for example, having a cloud access security broker capability, potentially with an overlay of something like a force.com. There's an interesting opportunity here amidst the tension of managing the move to cloud speed to actually take the savings you get on infrastructure and architecture and repurpose those to acquire the capabilities needed to ensure you're securing the cloud effectively and efficiently. Let me pause there to see if there are any questions. Okay, can we go to the next page? So some of the emerging practices that we see as we think about where the market is headed, particularly on cloud and cloud security, are around rebuilding the perimeter in the cloud, aligning application with the pace of migration, redesigning identity and access management and data protection, ensuring that you have the right system configuration in place, and aligning retained capabilities with the cloud services that are consumed. I think what's really important here is to make sure that as you think about the perimeter in the cloud, that you're giving serious consideration to things like zero trust, beyond corp, as models and ways of working that can actually take a lot of the guesswork out of cybersecurity and create a much more effective and efficient operating model. Let me pause here to see if there are any questions about the practices that we've laid out and some of the commentary. Okay, next page. The last two that we would talk through are moving from a ticket-based to an API-based security operating model. And what that really means is making security much more self-serve. This has the dual positive effect of giving the security team leverage over the organization and also making sure that security becomes everybody's responsibility, as individuals who may not have previously had security duties are now forced, in a good way, to think about and interact with security as a topic in the enterprise environment and as part of enabling their ability to do their day-to-day work. Go to the next page. I think the one thing we'd call out here to keep in mind as you particularly think about SAS delivery for the solutions that you're building to take to customers is that increasingly customers are expecting and placing a premium on the quality of security capabilities that are embedded into the SAS that they're delivering. There are a number of reasons for that trend and for why it will continue to grow. If you think about a lot of the headline making compromises for enterprises, they've recently been tied to faulty software, usually delivered as a service into one or more enterprise environments where unsuspecting frontline employees and click on things they shouldn't, precipitating a network effect that ends up having a material impact on a company or set of companies in an industry. And so for you all who in many cases have at the center of your value proposition something that you're delivering in a software as a service model, you'd want to think about what are the security responsibilities that you bear as a provider, particularly given the delta between those responsibilities if you were on-prem as opposed to being the software as a service provider. And where the biggest delta exists has to do primarily with a few areas: application configuration, runtime and middleware, the operating system, virtualization, compute, storage, and network, and the facilities that you use. I think all of these are important. Probably the most important one, where there's the greatest risk and also the greatest responsibility for a provider, as different from on-prem, is going to be application configuration, where how you end up configuring upstream can have material effects downstream when deployed with a customer in terms of exposing them or not to incremental risk. Let me pause here to see if there are any questions on this page. Great. So when we think about the focus on the interface between SaaS provider security capabilities and their environment, we find that that's actually a pretty important place for SaaS providers to deliver incremental value through security. And if you look at the top half on the left-hand side in the bar chart, at the top half, you'll see the areas that respondents, so customers, said that they'd like to see vendors, so their SaaS providers, really deliver pre-baked solutions that mean the buyer doesn't have to do the security or the seeking for the security themselves. But also important to understand, what are some of the table stakes expectations or expectations that aren't quite yet table stakes, but are close to crystallizing as table stakes over time. And if you look at the topics like on the far left-hand side, starting at the top of the bar graph, encryption and key management, integration with federated IAM, role-based IAM, monitoring and logging, integration with SOC SIEM and incident response. I mean, these all have to do with the intersection of the SaaS provider's tools and the customer's environment. And so thinking about how you manage and communicate in ways that create assurance and trust, what you're doing with your SaaS capabilities around encryption and key management, IAM and insider threat, telemetry for security with SOC and SIM, and incident response. So to make sure that you're providing through your capabilities to a customer the right level of metadata that's easily consumable to accelerate attribution, inspection, and remediation. I think these are all things to think about as you build out future feature functionality for your SaaS offerings. Let me pause there again to see if there are any questions about the insights on this page or how we think about the emerging expectations of customers from their SaaS providers. Okay, we'll go to the next page. So I think this is where we kind of are at the end of our content, but we wanted to close the presentation portion at least by talking through some of the ranges of actions that SaaS providers can take to become a true security leader. Thinking back to the value that can confer from a competitive standpoint around time to market, as well as a value proposition with consumers or customers where you're trying to build trust as part of the value proposition. As we think about this, there are a few that stand out. One is what we talked about earlier about integrating with the customer IT ecosystem and commonly used partner vendors. There are plenty of examples here. The biggest one that stands out that's a little bit different from what you might hear elsewhere is the pre-integration with leading tool providers, so that before you do something, roll something out, set up an ecosystem, set up an infrastructure or architecture or reference architecture, that you're clear from the beginning about where you are going to own things versus others and where others will own it, making sure that they're partners to the formation of that plan and strategy. The others that we would talk through are making sure that you're reducing customer overhead in configuring and utilizing APIs. And one way to do that is through a security customer success organization. So here, what it's all about is making sure that when you do your deployments as a SaaS provider or whatever the technology or capability is, that you not just have a success representative that's focused on helping the client capture the most value from the offering, but that you're also bringing in security to make sure that the customer is thinking about how can they operate in such a way that they're minimizing the risk of value destruction as a consequence of being insecure. The others that I would call out, just going through the list here, are as you think about integrating vendors for business resilience, making sure that you're engaging with customers to establish the role, and that you're creating provisions for the easy integration of SaaS services with vendors, and particularly that are supplying monitoring and detection, threat intelligence, simulation. I think key here is to note that, as you can tell from the list, it doesn't have to be everything, but that there are some pieces that are more critical than others from a risk reduction perspective. Those are the ones, the more critical ones that we have listed here. The last two I'd call out are the access to third-party validation to corroborate vendor self-assessments. So you want to make sure that as you hire vendors to help you with assessments for other parties, that you're actually checking the checker, and you don't have to do it everywhere. You don't have to do it for everything, but that at some level you have, at some layer, the right person to essentially validate the self-assessments that you get from your employees in the organization regarding the quality and capability of security and controls that have been implemented and how they align with the broader business strategy that we're forging in the next that it's being forged in the next couple of days when you're operating in that context. And then the last thing we would call out here is sort of highest standards in data privacy. So really making sure that you have a clear path on data residency. You also have role-based identity and access management. You have a point of view on, not just where you're storing your data from a data residency perspective, but which data you're storing for how long and why. And also, how are you storing your data in terms of, do you retain the integrity of the given data point with all of its metadata, or are you chopping it up or masking it in some way that it minimizes your risk in a confirmable, validatable way for a GDPR a GDPR tester that might come in to validate your compliance, or an ISO 27001 auditor. So making sure that you have a clear point of view on your data strategy and how that feeds privacy and security for the company is important. Typically at the startup level, that'll reside with whoever owns either IT or legal, or sometimes at the intersection of the two. But as your company may grow, enter new geographies where there's additional regulation beyond GDPR, like in the US with the California Privacy Act, you're going to want to be very thoughtful about how you adapt what might have been for your smaller company an easily followable universal code to making it something that still applies the universal principles, but tailored to the unique requirements of the regulatory landscape you're operating in. So that's some capture of what SaaS providers, and I think more than a few of you on the line are either there or aspiring to be there, but what they can do to become a true security and privacy leader. Let me pause at this point. I think we're at the end of our content to open up to any questions or thoughts or reflections that people on the line may have.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been really informative. If anyone has a question, please feel free to enter it in the panel now, and we will go through your questions. Wonderful. We have a question come in. What suggestions do you have for adding API-driven versus ticket-driven security?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are lots of ways to do it. And just because we talk about ticket versus API doesn't mean the contrast needs to be quite that stark to get to something that solves the core problem that API is intended to solve, which is really giving your security team more leverage and making sure that security is everyone's responsibility rather. And let me give you a concrete example of how you can get there in a way that can work within an organizational context without having to be heavy-handed about transition from ticket-based to API-based security. And the example comes from a technology company that we served recently that had actually missed out on a 8-figure business opportunity in a market because they didn't at the time have a secure software development lifecycle that they could articulate to the country market's regulator. And so they asked us to come in and help them think of one. And along the way, what we realized was that this was a classic case of ticket-based security with an under-leveraged and siloed centralized cybersecurity team that was touching at the time less than 15% of application development projects before they went to market, and creating a lot of friction and stress and risk for the company because of things that were entering the market without being touched by that team of experts. And so what we ended up doing is one of the streams of work to address this issue and get them to a better posture that would allow the business to move at speed was not to say, hey, we're going to move directly from ticket to API and announce it to the company across the enterprise. What we instead did was to focus on the secure software development lifecycle, where there was existing momentum because they'd already missed out on a commercial opportunity as a consequence of not having it. And so non-technical executive attention was being paid to the issue. And we said, okay, well, today, the company would, its application development teams would go into a tool called SD Elements, which essentially is a dashboard that spits out development requirements for software. And the software team goes to that tool, tells them what they want to build, and the tool will then spit out the set of software development requirements they need to follow, calibrated to the enterprise. We said, gee, if we could use that tool plus Jira to essentially code a taxonomy of security requirements that we could then piggyback on the back of the pre-programmed software development requirements, we could create a totally new operating model where it would suddenly become the case that the Scrum Master for a given development team, who is the person tasked with entering the application development task into SD Elements, that Scrum Master, when they entered that requirement for an application, would get back from SD Elements not just the list of software development requirements, but also, because of those software development requirements, the list of security requirements they needed to meet. And by doing that and setting that up, that taxonomy and the programming with the coding with Jira and SD Elements to ensure that controls were linked, security controls were linked to the right software development requirements, a couple things happened. Number one, the security coverage paradigm shifted at the company. It flipped, and the security team went from touching effectively less than 10% of projects before they went to market to touching nearly 100 through the security controls that SD Elements would spit out. Number two, the security team was able to get involved with more development teams by exception and know and be better about prioritizing their time, because they would only get involved in situations where teams had received a list of security requirements, but for whatever set of reasons were deciding not to follow some or all of them. And at that point, the security team would get involved. And it would also generate insights that would allow the security team to be better about policy and strategy, because if there were certain security controls they were requiring that many teams were choosing not to follow, that potentially created a question about whether or not you need that control, or do you need the control? And the answer is you actually need to educate the end user better. And the other things that happened were there was a material reduction in time to market for new applications that were generated. But also what came out of it was that the Scrum Master ended up becoming responsible in their development team for about 10 to 20% of their FTE time to be dedicated to security, where they would be educating the teams on the security requirements that they had to follow. They would also be providing feedback to the core cybersecurity team on whether or not and what was working or not working from a security requirement perspective, so that things could be changed if needed. But that transition, it's still ongoing, by the way, but happened over a period of several months in a couple of pilot instances, and they're now in the process of scaling it. So this is an example of how you can use a certain approach focused on existing technology and executive momentum to move from a ticket-based, under-leveraged, and undercovered, and therefore elevated risk model for cybersecurity to one where cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility and it's materially improving business operations. Let me pause there to see if that answers the question.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Next question. I'm hearing a bit of an echo. So any recommended security ROIs and other metrics meaningful for security ops and dev security ops customers?
Yeah, I mean, look, so if by DevOps and Sec DevOps customers, you mean, how do you create the right metrics for the business to ensure that you've got your arms around security and you're managing it effectively? I would think about this at least two ways. One is, are the metrics you're using ones that can feed into themselves and be synthesized up into some kind of metric or set of 3 to 5 metrics that you can report to the board in a way that the board understands whether or not you're getting security right? That's kind of number one. Number two, with the metrics that you choose, you want to make sure that these are metrics that are actionable and achievable for the people who are affected by them, and that you may, depending on the criticality of security to your value proposition, think about directly building these metrics, not just into reporting and tracking tools for management, but into performance reviews for employees. And let me give you a concrete example, especially for SaaS players where getting code right is important. You may want to think about having a metric, for example, about the instances or the percentage instances of vulnerabilities in code that your engineers are creating, and have that be part of their performance review, but also use that metric at a boiled up level across engineers and projects to show to the board overall what's your percentage code vulnerability rate, and what is the risk tolerance you've set for what you're willing to accept that rate to be, and what's your progress toward achieving the risk tolerant rate. And if you're struggling to achieve that risk tolerant rate, then you can have a very robust conversation about what to do about it, right? So that's an example of a pretty meaty metric that can be used a couple ways at the front line and at the board level, and that can drive really important and valuable conversations about resource allocation and return. Let me pause to see if that is a helpful example.
That was great. And last question, what is the top two end client objectives or drivers for desiring pervasive encryption?
Yeah, so if we're thinking about end client objectives, and I take that to mean sort of the end user buyer of what you deliver, and stop just right in the box to stop me if I'm wrong. But if that's what you're solving for and why a customer would want, end-to-end encryption as part of what you're delivering to them, I think there are really, two core reasons. One typically has to do with IP concerns, and so whatever application or SaaS or capability you're delivering, especially in a B2B context, that business buyer is going to want to make sure that what they're procuring from you is not creating another point of vulnerability that's potentially going to expose some material part of their data to an external party. But I think another part of it too is around insider threat and also shielding themselves from others that you may be serving. So as a SaaS provider, you're probably operating in some kind of multi-tenant infrastructure, which exposes you to other SaaS providers as well as potentially to your customer, depending on the configuration. And in that environment, having end-to-end encryption is at least reassuring in that it creates one more obstacle for attackers who may enter through other means from easily bootstrapping their way into the customer environment. So those would be basically the two main reasons that I would hypothesize you would see an end user customer preferencing or desiring as a design feature end-to-end encryption for whatever SaaS application or other tool you're delivering.
Wonderful, great answer. So I'll leave just 1 minute for any follow-up questions. And if not, we will end now. Thank you so much, Mark, for a wonderful presentation. To everyone who's on the line, we will be sharing the recording and the slides out by the end of the day. So keep a lookout for Insight, an email from Insight. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Insight.
Thank you.